If you're using Airtable for any kind of project management, you absolutely need to track dates of things that you've assigned to people on your team. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down for you how you can automatically update those dates when there are changes made to the plan. So if learning more about this is of interest to you, stick around and let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Gareth and this is Gap Consulting, and we make it our mission to help you get the most out of no-code tools, Airtable being one of our favorite tools that we're going to be diving into in this video. But before we get into things, I first want to invite you to join me for some additional free training. If you like what you see here and you want to master the fundamental elements and components of the Airtable software, we put together a free training that we call Airtable Crash Course. You can sign up absolutely free and get access to that. It'll be delivered to your email over a few days. Go ahead and sign up at gapconsulting.io/airtable-crash-course, and I'll include that link wherever you found this video. But without further ado, let's go ahead and hop on into the heart of things. We're going to take a look first at our setup so that we can identify what different components we need before we start automating these date dependencies. Now, I've got a pretty simple setup here. I have projects and tasks. Projects, very, very basic. I've got the assignee here. I don't really need this field. I could get rid of this. I have a name for a project. You could obviously keep a lot more data on the project level, but the stuff that we want to really break down is on the task side. So these projects are going to connect to tasks. As you see here, we've got that linked relationship right there. So one task is assigned to one project, whereas one project will consist of multiple tasks. Now here inside of the tasks, I give the tasks a name. Then I also link them to the project, as we already discussed. I also have an assignee field where I can bring in a user inside of my Airtable base, whether they're at the interface level or actually back here at the backend database structure level. Then I can bring that user in and assign them to these tasks. I also have a dependency. Now, this is a self-linked table, meaning that we've linked tasks to themselves. And so we're linking back to tasks here, allowing multiple record links. And what we're selecting here is what is the task that must first occur before this one can be done. And so here, for example, we've said this task right here, project one, task one, that has to be complete before we can do this next task right here. And before we can move on to project one, task three, we need to complete this dependency, which is project one, task two. You get the idea. There's this waterfall effect, this snowballing, that if the thing up here doesn't get done, we can't work on the next thing down in the chain. Now, in some cases, we might have multiple things that we require to be completed. So for a case like that, you'll see that we've linked to two things. So for this particular task to be completed, we must first complete project two, task one, and project two, task two. It's possible that we have to look at both of those to decide when we can actually start the next task. Now, this is a good time where I should pause and say Airtable has built in their own native functionality for updating dates that does not require what I'm about to show you here. But the reason I think it's important to go a layer deeper and to learn this skill that I'm sharing with you here is because the native Airtable relative dates don't necessarily work as well as you might think. Sometimes you might move a date up in time, like moving it so that it's due earlier, and you won't see the impact affecting your roll down. So all of those subsequent dependent dates don't get impacted the way that the current feature works. So in order to get that full access, I mean a date that is quick and snappy that updates in real time, then we need to go a layer deeper as we're going to dive into right here. So here are the remaining requirements for building this out. I have a start date, and it's important that we note that this is a blank date field, meaning that you drop in your date. This is the editable date field where anybody can select any date right here. Okay. Next, we have task duration. This is a duration field type, and we've set the precision to days. So what we're doing is we're saying this particular task starts on 5/1, and the task duration is 5 days, so we can calculate the end date. This is an important outcome here. So this third component is calculated with the Airtable formula, and it looks exactly like this. The most important part of this formula is what I've highlighted here in the center. It's the date add function. We're saying we're taking the start date, that's the first parameter here, and then we are adding to it the duration field, that's the second parameter. And what unit are we counting in? We're counting in days. So we have to type out days, and this goes into single or double quotes. So this component works perfectly well on its own. However, if we don't include the if condition at the beginning, then we get errors on this date formula. So in the case where we don't have a start date or we don't have a task duration, this formula will error out and it'll say, I'm trying to calculate the end date for you, but you haven't given me the variables that I need in order to calculate that. So in order to make this as complete as possible so that we don't get errors on our formula, we include first the and condition. So we're saying that we must have a start date and a task duration before we calculate this formula. And note that this is inside of an if statement. So inside of the if statement, we're saying if these two things are true, then we'll calculate the date, and this removes our errors. As you can see here, it's working perfectly, but there is a little catch that you must be aware of, and it has to do with time zones. So here, we cannot select a time zone on our start date. We can display it, but that's all we can do. And you'll notice that this is always going to be shown in Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT. Now, we cannot impact that unless we go in deeper and include time. And once we include time, then we can say whether or not we want to use the same time zone for all collaborators. And if we do, then we can insist on a particular time zone. So that's a lot. And for us, we're just doing date dependencies. We don't need all of this. I'm hopeful that maybe in the future, Airtable updates this and makes it a little bit more robust. But right now, this is what we have. So I will exclude time and I will not display the time zone, but we have to remember that this is in Greenwich Mean Time, which means for us that all of our calculations therefore must be in Greenwich Mean Time. Otherwise, they're not going to line up. They're not going to match. So you'll note over here that on my formatting for my end date, I must also use the same time zone for my collaborators. If I don't do this, and I set it like this, you'll note that it goes into my local time zone, which is mountain time. And so it's not calculating from day to day, it's actually rewinding 7 hours, and it makes it look like it's the improper calculation. You know, if I'm taking May 1st, adding 5 days to it, you would expect that to be May 6th. So let's make sure that we are in the formatting here and that we have used the same time zone and it's Greenwich Mean Time, so long as that's what we're starting with over here. Your time zones have to match, otherwise you're going to have a big discrepancy. Now we're almost done with the setup, but our last field here is to look up the end of dependencies. So this is a rollup field, and we're looking at our dependency here where we've said, hey, we know that this task requires another task to be done already. So we're looking at that relationship and we're wanting to bring in the end date from that dependency. And so we can take that and plug it in right here. And you see that it's working because this task right here, project 1 task 2, this relies on project 1 task 1. And the end date for project 1 task 1 is May 6th. And so that's what we see here as well. You'll also notice that it's displaying Greenwich Mean Time. That's because we want to make sure that everything is in the same time zone. Again, if we're not in the same time zone on our calculations, things are going to break. The last thing I want to point out about this field is that we're taking the max values, which means that if I have multiple dependencies with multiple end dates, I'm going to look at the biggest one, the maximum of those end dates. So if I've got multiple different things that I'm relying on, as in this case right here, I'm going to find out whichever of those tasks ends later, and that will be the value that I display in the end of dependencies output here. Now we have all the components that we require for our next step. All I really want to do here is say, hey, look, task 1, it ends on 5/6, May 6th. I want to take anything that relies on this, right, where the dependency is that previous task, and I just want to copy that value, their end date, and I want to paste it into this start date. I just copied and pasted, and you saw immediately that my table updated. I copied this value over here, right? So simple. All I did was copy paste, and now I have a new start date, I have my task duration, and I can easily calculate the new end date. And then what happens? Well, we know that this third task relies on this second one. So this is now showing up down here, and I would want to copy and paste again. And once I do that, I've got this cascading effect. Now, check it out. If I make a change here and I bump this back to April 29th, let's say, we're going to calculate a different end date, which is going to show up a different value right here, which would then mean I would copy and paste. And then down here, I've got a different value again. So I would copy and paste. And now I can pretty quickly update. But who wants to copy and paste? This is 2024, as of recording anyway. We want to automate. Let's automate this so that anytime there's a change to this field where it does not match this field, we automatically update it. So let's build yet one more formula. This is going to be just the formula for automation. You can call it whatever you'd like. And inside of here, I'm going to say, if two things are equal, then be blank. But if they're not equal, then I want you to tell us that it's time to trigger the automation. So if the start date is equivalent to the end of dependencies rollup field, if these two dates are equal, then be blank. We say that like this: blank, open, close parenthesis. If that's not the case, then I want you to output the word trigger automation, just like that. So let's create this field and see what we have here. So here we're seeing that in the first case here, I don't have an end of dependencies. And so obviously it's telling me, well, these two fields are not equal. 429 is not equal to a blank value, so trigger the automation. It's not exactly what we want, so we're going to have to refine this a little bit. But you'll notice that over here, I've got matches, so this is blank. And here I've got matches, so this is blank. Let's make a change to our end date and verify this. If my original end date here, let's say, is 5/7, what does that mean? Well, now we see that it says trigger automation for all of these because we just recalculated all of these dates and we need to refire this automation. So let's do a little more refining on this particular formula and make sure that we say we're only going to check this value if we have a start date and an end of dependency. So we'll, just as we did before, we'll start with an if statement. If we have these components, a start date, a task duration, and lastly, my end of dependencies. If I have all of these values, all of them must simultaneously exist. If they do, then I will paste in my original if statement. So a nested if statement here, a little bit complicated. Let's not get overwhelmed by it. We broke it into parts where we said, first, we know what this chunk inside is doing. We're evaluating the equivalence of these two formulas or these two fields. And here we're saying we're only going to calculate that if we have all the pieces we need. Let's save it up and see what happens. Now we've removed our incorrect trigger automation and we're ready for the next and final step. We're going to build the automation. So inside of here, I set up an automation inside of Airtable where I say, if I notice that a record matches conditions in my tasks table, and that condition very specifically is that I'm looking for that formula for automation, and if it contains or is trigger automation, that's what we told it to output when we want the automation. Well, then in that condition, we are wanting to automate this. So let's pick a task here, and then we'll move on to the last step, which is going to be to update the record that triggered the automation. So here we go. We're updating a task, and we have to find the record ID from the trigger. Right here is the Airtable record ID. And all we want to update is the start date. Remember, all we did before was copy the value from our end of dependency, and we copied it and pasted it into the start date. So start date is where I want to update here. I'm going to flip on the gear and go to a dynamic value. And I'm going to say, I want to plug in the end of dependencies. That's what we named that rollup field. So that's simply performing the copy and paste with an automation. Now we've got it set. Let's name our automation and turn it on. And then for the fun stuff, we go back and we test it, right? So we need to first re-engage these records because we need to make this trigger automation go away. So let's take that date of dependency. I'm going to flip it in right here and paste it. And all right, let's start this by updating task 1. So let's say that this project got moved up. Remember, if this project got moved up and you're using the standard Airtable way of updating your dependencies, this will not work. So with our advanced trick here, we're going to move this to April 15th and watch it go in the background. Boom, boom, boom. Automation's ticking, everything updated just like that. Now you can imagine how amazing this is. All you have to do is make one change or increase or decrease the duration of a task. Let's move it to 8. Once I do that, again, you're going to see everything move, all the automations clicking in the background. I hope you got a ton of value out of this video and are able to successfully implement this. But if you have any questions, be sure to swing by our website and don't hesitate to reach out. That's it for this one. In the meantime, keep on building.